Good evening, and welcome to an evening with Rena Finder. Thank you for joining us. My name is Rabbi Yankee Majeski. My wife Hanshi and I run Chabad of North Orlando and Nate Scholl on Markham Woods Road. This past week, someone said to me, Rabbi, I'd love to come to services, but I don't know where to buy a wig in Orlando, and you certainly won't allow me in Scholl without one. This is a true story. A few days before that, someone else said to me, I was shocked that you allow an English prayer book and your classes and sermons are in English. I thought everything had to be in Hebrew. Because there's so much confusion about what Chabad is, what we stand for, I like to take a moment at these occasions to explain so you know who we are. Chabad is a Jewish outreach organization with thousands of centers throughout the world, including 7 right here in Metro Orlando. Though closely affiliated with each other, each Chabad center is completely independent and funded 100% by the local community. The secret behind Chabad's explosive growth is 2 principles which may seem in the eyes of many contradictory, but really truly go hand in hand. While it is true that we are committed to traditional Judaism without changing our age-old traditions, at the same time, we meet every Jew where they are. Everyone is welcome, regardless of affiliation, background, observance, lack thereof, or level of Jewish education. It is for this reason you walk into any Chabad center, any Chabad house, you'll find many things, but no Chabadniks. You will find Jews who consider themselves Reform, who consider themselves Orthodox, who consider themselves conservative, you name it, unaffiliated, because no one is ever judged, and we always focus on what we have in common as fellow human beings. At Chabad, we like to say we present Judaism a la carte, and you are welcome to partake on the level that you feel most comfortable. Tonight's lecture is part of our ongoing adult education classes and lectures and programs that we offer to the broader community. Next March, in 2018, we're helping organize a trip to Israel, which will be luxurious, educational, and fun. Whether you have been to Israel before or this will be your first time, you're going to love this trip. Please pay attention to the screen for a moment, a short video presentation on our upcoming trip to Israel, the land and spirit.
Any Jew who hasn't been to Israel, or even if you have been, you need to come on a JLI trip to experience this. I guarantee you it'll be the highlight of your life.
Everything was so well organized, so well timed.
Everyone was so caring.
It's just wonderful to be here, and I feel that I'm in heaven. The most magnificent meals and the best speakers I've ever seen.
Learned more in this 2 days since I've been here about my religion and the history than I could have ever in school.
And just knowing that such incredible events of the world have taken place there and you actually feel it. This is very deep.
It's making me much more aware of my faith and my heritage.
Also Friday night at the hotel, that was truly unbelievable.
And to see the spirit of all the people at the wall.
And going into the tunnels, the excavations of the Western Wall was just amazing. So exciting to go where Abraham walked the streets in Hebron.
I just got out of swimming in the Dead Sea, climbed Masada.
We saw basically this whole country, and in just a few days' time, and it seems like every place we went was just an experience that you didn't want to forget.
The uniqueness of this trip and what JLI was able to organize goes well beyond a typical trip. Introduced to high-level politicians, we were introduced to individuals. One of the highlights for me, absolutely, me personally, was being able to meet the soldiers.
Well, it's just everything that JLI does is just first rate. And when you take the courses or whatever it is that they offer, you just recognize that immediately.
The trip itself was extraordinary. I loved it.
Whether you've never been to Israel like myself, or whether you've been to Israel 100 times, you've never been to Israel until you've been here with JLI.
It's not a trip, this is a journey. To me, it's the beginning of a journey of discovering myself and what being a Jew is all about.
I'm already planning to come back. It's the most amazing thing that's ever happened to me. I never thought I'd feel this strongly about it.
Don't miss it. Don't miss this opportunity.
This is a trip you don't want to miss.
It'll be life-changing. Next year in Israel.
I strongly encourage you to consider joining us for this trip, arguably the best bang for your buck when it comes to Israel trips. We also have a weekly Talmud class every Tuesday night, a Kabbalah Hasidus class Saturday morning before services, fascinating lecture, the Jewish Secrets of the Sistine Chapel coming up next month. The flyers are on your chair. Rabbi Benjamin Blech wrote a fascinating book analyzing Michelangelo's art. I think you'll find it quite interesting. The first weekend in May, we are leading a group for a Shabbaton in Brooklyn, the heart of the Orthodox Jewish community. You can experience a real modern-day shtetl for a weekend. It should be a wonderful experience. Encourage you to consider joining us for that. Also on your cheers, we have information of the new JLI series will start in the beginning of May in honor of 50 years since the Six-Day War. You have lots of information. That should be a fascinating course, as all courses from the Jewish Learning Institute. We have a Passover Seder. Tomorrow's the last day to register. You're welcome to join us for that. Passover's just around the corner. We have many programs for teens, children, even a mommy and me, Shabbat dinners, and of course, regular Shabbat services. One more trip I'd like to draw your attention to. This will be a short clip. The National Jewish Retreat. We've gone with local groups several years, and I hope you can join us this year. It's a wonderful weekend of entertainment, of learning. Speakers from all over the Jewish world come together, and I think you would really enjoy it.
Welcome to the National Jewish Retreat. An unparalleled gathering of world-class Jewish thinkers. The finest of kosher cuisine and entertainment. It's a place to refresh your spirit, relax, and be inspired.
With a world-class faculty and a spectacular array of events and programs, this week will allow you all to grow in mind, in spirit, and I hope not too much in body.
It's more than just a retreat. It's the National Jewish Retreat. Join us this August at the luxurious JW Marriott Desert Springs Resort and Spa in Palm Springs, California. Register today at jretreat.com.
We are planning to go with a local group, and if anybody's interested to join, you can contact me. I am very accessible, cell phone, WhatsApp, Facebook, email, and Instagram. If someone says, a nice old Jewish man says to me, "You're a user-friendly rabbi." So I look forward to hearing from you if you have questions of any of our programs. I want to take a moment to thank Ron Red for the AV tonight. Always doing such a wonderful job. It's always a pleasure to work with you. We can give him a round of applause. special thank you to the members of our Chai Club. The way Chabad operates, we don't have a formal membership because we believe that everybody is a member automatically. You live in this community, you're automatically a member at all of our programs. But we do need to keep the lights on and the doors open, and we appreciate those who contributed monthly to allow us to do all of our programming and bring such wonderful opportunities and celebrations to the community. I want to thank the sponsors for tonight's event specifically, who all will be receiving an autographed copy of Schindler's List, the movie, autographed by Mrs. Finder. Thank you, Pam and Herb Licht, Dr. Jay and Susie Gilob, Dr. Bob and Fabienne Kaplan, Barry and Elizabeth Small, David Meltzer, and Kathy Holt, who are not here this evening. But thank you very much. Though anti-Semitism is by no means a thing of the past, we are blessed to live in a wonderful country, the United States, and in a society which, as a whole, rejects racism and bigotry. We are very honored and touched to have with us tonight a representative of the Seminole County Sheriff's Office to offer greetings and support to the Jewish community, and greetings to Mrs. Finder. Sheriff Dennis Lima was unable to make it here in person tonight. We are honored to have with us Chief of Staff for the Sheriff. Please join me in giving me a warm welcome to Heather Smith of the Seminole County Sheriff's Office.
Good evening. Thank you for having me here today. This is truly an honor and a pleasure to be here. Unfortunately, Sheriff Dennis Lima did have a prior already scheduled obligation for tonight, so he was unable to attend, but he did want to ensure that he sent his sincere regrets and also a personal message that I'd like to read to you. Dear Rabbi Majeski and members of the Chabad Lubavitch North Orlando, I thank you for inviting the Seminole County Sheriff's Office to share in tonight's event. We commend you for your longstanding commitment to our community and your work to encourage openness and inclusiveness. Seminole County is truly honored to have Ms. Rena Finder here tonight. Her story is one of courage and survival, and I applaud her for sharing her experience across the country. Although I am not able to be there to hear her testimony, please know that we at the Seminole County Sheriff's Office will not forget the unspeakable horrors that she, her late husband, and her family endured. Her experience was unthinkable then and unthinkable today, yet the legacy she leaves will help ensure this atrocity will never be forgotten. I understand Ms. Finder has also made it her mission to share her story with our youth, speaking to them about bullying and bravery. She teaches children, and indeed all of us, that there is always something that we can do. Like Mr. Schindler, a man who could not stand by and do nothing, she brings a message of empowerment and hope. Whoever saves one life saves the world entire. I applaud her for her tremendous work and her lifetime of contributions. Our mission at the Seminole County Sheriff's Office is to enhance the quality of life by reducing crime and the fear of crime. We work to build a safer and more secure community and to fight against injustice, bias, and prejudice. So tonight, please know that we stand with you to educate, to enable, and to inspire our next generation. We share a common vision for building unity in our community, and we look forward to continuing to partner with you to that end. Sincerely, Sheriff Dennis Lima.
I'm a very tired, old, and worn-out man, and my eyes have long been blind. Most things that people say to me just seem to slip my mind. Oh, but the suffering and painful times that were in years long gone still as clear upon my memory as the numbers on my arm. What will become of all the memories? Are they to scatter with the dust in the breeze? Who'll stand before the world knowing what to say when the very last survive was? my grandson close to me, and his fingers trace the pattern of my tears. He asks me, Zayda, tell me, why do you cry? What is it that you fear? Oh, and I tell him, there once was another child who smelled this sweet and felt this warm, but he was taken from before my eyes, and only I remain to mourn. What will become of all the memories? Are they to scatter with the dust in the breeze? And who will stand before a world that now wishes to deny? How will they believe in someone never heard the cry? Never heard the cries. There is little I can say or do to make things change. Time has a way of passing by so fast. Like a fleeting shadow, no one will recall the faces of the past. What will become of all the memories? Are they to scatter with the dust in the breeze? Yet one thought gives me comfort. It's all that I have left. For I know that God in heaven won't forget.
What will become of all the memories? A few weeks ago, I had a guest for Shabbat dinner, call him John. The conversation led to our upcoming programming, and he asked me, why are you bringing Rena? Why do we need to hear this? It just makes us sad. I was taken back by the question and even surprised. Of course, the answer is so obvious. I found myself feeling silly needing to explain this to a Jewish man in his 30s. I felt like I was explaining 2 + 2 = 4. If you don't know why you need to hear this, you certainly must come there. Anti-Semitism is alive and well around the world, even here in the United States. Right here in Longwood and Altamont Springs, there were recently swastikas in local public schools. I continue to explain how a very popular word in the Torah is zachor, remember. Shabbos is zikaron. Zecher is a remembrance. Passover is a remembrance. Purim is a remembrance. Yizkor on the holidays, remember. Only by remembering the past can we ensure the future, and perhaps this constant emphasis on memory maybe is one of the secrets of Jewish survival through the centuries. We must create awareness in the society, I said to him, of the dangers of tolerating hate. But I must admit that the strange question did make me think, what do I expect of John? In his personal life, what should he do about this? What do I hope for him to walk away from tonight's lecture? Of course, I want him to be an Oskar Schindler. I want him to stand up against hate. But what can he do if he doesn't encounter anti-Semitism? Is there nothing that he can do? The sad reality is that the recent bomb threats were being made by a fellow Jew is a reminder that indeed the biggest threat to our survival sometimes is us ourselves. I don't mean perhaps only a mentally unstable individual making bomb threats on his own people. What I do mean is the statistics are out there. 50% of Jews alive today will not have Jewish grandchildren, according to the statistics. We all need to ask ourselves, what are we doing for Jewish survival? Are we educating ourselves? Are we educating our children about the warmth, depth, and beauty of Yiddishkeit? Or do I do so because this is how we do it? Reb Shmuel Munkus, a famous chassid, lived about 200 years ago in Russia, was traveling to his Rebbe by foot, freezing Russian winter. And he was overjoyed when he saw a passing by wagon that offered him a ride on the wagon. He was even more excited to learn that the wagon was filled with barrels of vodka. And he heard that vodka warms you up. And he's sitting there amongst the barrels of vodka, and he wasn't becoming warm. And he says, it doesn't help to sit amongst the vodka, you got to taste. So he asked the wagon driver if he can have a swallow. He said, sure, help yourself. And he made a l'chaim, he made a blessing, and he was warm, and he was happy. He later shared with his friends the lesson that he had in this little episode. You could be surrounded by Judaism. You could be surrounded with amazing, warm things, as good as vodka. But if you don't learn, if you don't internalize it, you remain cold. We can go on vacation all around the world and visit old synagogues. Look at Torah scrolls behind a glass exhibit. Look at Kiddush cups and menorahs in Jewish museums around the world. But you know, the Nazis also wanted to have a Jewish museum. The Germans wanted to make a museum all about the race that was. To win Hitler, we must live Yiddishkeit, not just look at the Shoah as a relic of the past, but something alive, something real in our life. We can't see the Torah scroll just as a beautiful work of art, but something that's very much real in the present. In the early 1990s, after the fall of communism, a young Chabad couple went out to open a Jewish school in a particular city. They had an open house for parents, and they expected 50 parents to show up. 450 former Jews from the former Soviet Union showed up to the open house. They had to rearrange themselves, their program. They broke out into little groups, and several parents at a time had a little round table, and they asked, why'd you come here today? One fellow said, anti-Semitism in the local schools. Another said, the local schools don't offer a good education. Another said, my bubby was nagging me. He wants my kids to go to a Jewish school. Everyone had their reason. One man sat quiet. The rabbi, please share. Why did you come here today? He said, I'll share my story, but I'm a little embarrassed. When I was 7 years old, the Nazis occupied Hungary. The war was coming close to a close, but the Germans were trying to kill as many Jews as possible. One night, I hear my parents arguing in the living room. No one knows that we're Jewish. But what if there is some old friend or neighbor that does know? But we don't have anything Jewish in the house. We don't celebrate any holidays. There's no trace of anything Jewish at this home, no mezuzah. My mother looked up to the top shelf, and over there was a little siddur, a little prayer book, given to her on her wedding day by her mother, who received it from her mom on the day of her chuppah, on her wedding day. The only Jewish object in the entire home. Looking at the fireplace, back at my dad, back at the siddur, my dad nodded. My mom threw the siddur into the flames. As the flames are consuming the siddur, my mom fell to the floor in agony. Oy, Bubby, oy, Zaidi, oy, Eibishter, oy, Grandma, oy, Grandpa, oh my God. I was only 7. I didn't know what it meant to be Jewish, but I knew that I just witnessed in some way an end of an era. I knew I saw something very sad. I ran to my room, cried on my pillow for hours with those words, Oy, Bubby, oy, Zaidi, oy, Eibishter. Those tears never stopped, and for over 40 years, I cannot get that image of that burning book and my mother on the ground near the fireplace out of my head. So you ask why I'm here today? I'm going to register my kid in this school. I will take my kid by the hand on the first day to his classroom, and I will personally hand him his siddur, and the flames will finally stop burning. The tears will finally dry. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope this is what we can take away from tonight's evening. It's up to me. It's up to you. We must make sure that there's a Jewish tomorrow, not only by remembering the Holocaust, but being active members of a Jewish life. There are so many resources out there. Mentioned a few before. You can join the JLI classes. You can learn so much online. There's so much Torah available online. Chabad.org, JNet, which offers you a study program for free over the phone for a half hour a week on a topic that you choose. Let's make the tears dry. Let's make the flames stop. Let's make sure that we are members of the Jewish community. Let's make sure that our children are members of the Jewish community. We are here tonight in the presence of a very special woman, a true inspiration, and I am truly humbled to be in her presence. Rena, if not for people like you who came out of the hell and once again built a Jewish home, a Jewish family and community, the Nazis would have, God forbid, had it their way. Judaism would have been in a museum. Thank you, Rena, for what you have done for Am Yisrael, for surviving, preserving Jewish identity. And thank you for coming here tonight to share your story. Please give a warm welcome to our guest speaker, Mrs. Rena Finder.
Thank you very much. Thank you so very much, and good evening to all. And can you all hear me? I am very humbled by being here in your presence. And I'm very moved by you, Esther, and by the local sheriff's remarks. That's where our hope lives. Our hope is that the message of the Holocaust, the testimony of the survivors, reaches people, young people. That is our future. I am a survivor of the Holocaust, and I want you to know the survivors have very selected memories. You can have 5 people in one place at the same time, and everybody remembers different things. I remember mostly my childhood, and I think that because I did have a good childhood, I probably had the strength to face the improbable, impossible, something that you could never imagine. When I was a little girl, I lived in Krakow, Poland. I am an only child. My father was one of 8 brothers and a sister. My mother had 7 siblings, and life was wonderful. No matter how many grandchildren my grandparents had, everyone was special. So I always felt very rich because there was so much love around me. Now I remember my parents talking about pogroms, about the anti-Semitism, but it never really touched me. I didn't know very much about it. I actually remember that I was taught a poem about the pogroms when I was little. And it was just a story. It didn't mean anything to me. And only in 1938 and probably a little bit in 1937, but especially the beginning of 1939, that I remember really hearing what was happening in Germany. And I still couldn't believe anything bad because my dad traveled a lot and he used to go to Germany on business. And whenever he came back, he always brought me a gift, something that you couldn't buy in Poland. Besides, what I knew about Germany was only about the famous writers and composers. And I always felt, well, you know, they are human beings just like us. They are fathers and husbands and brothers and sons. They are doctors and lawyers and bricklayers and electricians. What is there to fear? After all, my father and his brother, my grandfather, they all fought during the First War. As a matter of fact, my mother's oldest brother was a surgeon, and he was killed on the battlefield. The Jewish people were very patriotic in Poland. They loved Poland. The tragic was that Poland didn't love us. And I remember the first day of school, the first grade. I was playing at recess time, and one of the little girls picked up a stone and threw it at me. And she said, "You dirty Jew." And I remember I came home crying because I said to my mom, "Why did you say I was dirty? I took a shower this morning." How do you explain hate? to a little girl who never knew hate. How do you explain hate now? Unfortunately, right now, the way I feel about the world, it reminds me too much about 1938 and 1939. And that was unthinkable. That was when the world went black and deaf and dumb. When people closed their minds, closed their eyes, they didn't hear and they did not care. I am a very lucky person because I survived on Schindler's List. And I'm sure that all of you here must have seen the movie. And I want you to know that everything in that movie was really what happened to me. It was minor details which Steven Spielberg had to cut down, otherwise the movie would have been twice as long. And that, just put it on the table. I remember that when the war started, I remember that the men in the family decided to run away, go towards Russia, because they all felt the war is only going to last 3 weeks. Something will happen, the world will come and help us. Well, the world did not come to help us. Germany marched into Poland, and within, I think, probably 10 days, they occupied the country. The Polish army didn't have a chance against them. The Polish soldiers, they remind me on 1776 war. They didn't have the rifles that work. They didn't have uniforms. They had horses. And I remember seeing the German mighty army walked in, and I was standing on a sidewalk, and I still felt, well, they look just like everybody I know. It can't be all bad. Of course, at the same time, Russia also started a war on Poland, and so the men came back to be with their families. And my father was still saying, don't worry, everything is going to be okay. Within a week of the German occupation, the German issued orders against Jewish people, so that overnight, from being a little girl, I became an enemy of the state. Because the first orders were, Jewish children were not allowed to go to school. Jewish people were not allowed to own businesses. Our bank accounts were frozen. The businesses was confiscated. We were not allowed to own pets. We were not allowed to walk on a sidewalk. Of course, the schools, we were not allowed to go to schools. And we had in Krakow, because that's where the governor was, in Krakow and its surrounding communities, we wore a white band with a blue Star of David. We were all on a very strict curfew and also very small food stamps. So like overnight, everything changed drastically. And we were told that anybody under 12 or anybody over 50 would be taken away from Krakow and sent away to the farms to help the farmer grow food for the German army. The rest of the people with permits would be moved into a ghetto, where they're going to create a ghetto. At that time, 1939, there was about 250,000 people living in Krakow, and probably about 50,000 were Jewish, and the Jewish people actually lived all over the place. There was, of course, a Jewish section with a lot of synagogues and very Orthodox people, but the rest of us just could live anywhere. And so when they started to build the ghetto, the Krakow ghetto, it was in the older part of the city, right across the river, over the bridge. And they evacuated about 1,500 people living there. And then the Jewish people with a permit would go and occupy that area. They built a wall around it with lots of wires and all kinds of things, glass on top of the walls, so nobody could escape. And I remember that we went to obtain a permit. My parents were able to falsify my birth certificate. I was tall for my age, so they made me a year younger. And I remember standing in front of the building, waiting our turn to get a permit. And that was in the middle of the beautiful city of Krakow. I don't know how many of you have been in Poland, and if you have, whether you went to see Krakow, which is a beautiful, beautiful place. And where we lived was especially beautiful because it was right next to an ancient castle and right across the river. And I remember standing and looking around, and we were surrounded by what it seems to me like hundreds and hundreds of soldiers. And the SS soldiers were armed not just with revolver, but also and machine guns, but also with dogs. The dogs were huge. I don't think I've ever seen a big dog like that after the war. And the dogs were trained to attack people. They were muzzled and they were growling. And the soldier who stood maybe 20 feet away from me, a little girl standing, shaking from fear, and he was threatening to let the dog jump on me. And I remember looking across the street because the Polish people were occupied, but they were not enslaved. And so they all were going around their business. They were going to school, they were going shopping, they were going to the offices, whatever they had to do. And nobody saw us. Nobody looked at us. Nobody heard us. It was like we didn't exist. People who lived in Poland for centuries. And all of a sudden, it's like we were dead already. I remember this feeling of betrayal and disbelief that people can stand there and do nothing when they saw how the soldiers were separating families, little children. They were screaming. Nobody cared. Nobody cared. I remember we were given a permit and I was given a permit to stay, but we had to leave our homes. We were given about 2 weeks, I think, to move everything that we were allowed to take. And we were assigned a little small apartment that we shared with other people in the Podgórz ghetto outside the river. And I remember that we had a small suitcase of our personal things. My father was able to get a pushcart where we put some pots and pans and some linen and comforter. And I remember standing in my bedroom and looking around. I was a very good student, and every time I was on the honor roll, my mother would offer me a gift. And I either chose a Shirley Temple doll or a book. I loved the books. And my mom said, you can't take it with you. We have no room. We're not allowed to. And I also remember to this day that in the dining room, my mother had a Chinese tea set, which she got as a wedding gift. And I loved it. It was so beautiful. And I looked at it, and my mom said, you can't take it. We can't take it either. We have no room. I remember as we were leaving the apartment, we put on so many clothes, so many layers, because we weren't allowed to take so many things with us. And it was cold. It was March. I believe it was March 13, 1940. And it was freezing, and yet it wasn't snowing. And I wanted to say goodbye to my neighbors. I was born in that house, in that building. I was 10 years old, lived there. And I was friendly. I wanted to say goodbye. And I rang the doorbells as we were going down the stairs, but somehow nobody seemed to be home. So as we started to pull away, and I turned back to take like my last look at the only home I knew, I could see that behind the closed windows and lacy curtains, all my neighbors were looking at us, but not one of them had the guts to say goodbye. And I remember walking through the narrow streets of Krakow with young people lined up and throwing mud at us and throwing stones at us and yelling, good riddance, Jew, don't ever come back. And we marched into the ghetto behind the wall. And we were assigned a place in an apartment building that was very, very old. It was so old that the bathrooms were outside in a hall for all the apartments on each floor to share. And I remember walking into the kitchen. It was on the 4th floor, I remember. I don't remember how we got there with the few things that we had. And I remember walking into the kitchen and looking. It was so tiny, and there was a sink on the wall. And the sink was so low and so small that I had just seen the movie before the war started about the Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And I said to my mom, that sink looks like it belongs to the dwarfs. How are we going to handle it? And of course we unpacked. We had like half a room. It was one room. There were already 3 people living there. I remember my parents put on a nail on each side of the wall, a rope, and hung up a sheet. And so half of the small room was ours, and the other half belonged to actually the friends of my parents and their sister. And my father said, don't worry, it's not going to last long. The world will hear outside what's happening to us, and they will come and help us. In the meantime, those of us in the ghetto, we were working, we were slaves. People who owned businesses before the war were forced to create businesses in the ghetto so that everybody would be working. So we felt very hopeful because we were unpaid labor. And there were all kinds of workshops. There was a tailor and dressmaker. The people were making helmets. There were shoemakers, fur makers. I remember I was working in a printing shop, and I remember operating a huge machine with somebody else, where you put rolls and rolls of the paper, and they went through the machine and came out the other side with all kinds of lines on it. And you work like from 12 hours a day, and you change the shifts. Sometimes you work at night, sometimes you work during the day. But my father said, that's not going to last long. Things will get better. We'll be safe. And you know, the streetcar went through the ghetto, connecting the outside of the world. So when the streetcars went by, of course, all the doors were closed, like if anybody wanted to come out, and certainly nobody could get in. And I remember thinking, well, those people go back and forth through the ghetto. They know what's happening. Because in the ghetto, while we were working so hard and had such high hopes, the soldiers were patrolling the ghetto every day and during the night, and people were being arrested, people were taken away. If you were sick in a hospital, if you were there in the morning, you would be shot. Nobody wanted to go to the hospital, no matter how sick they were. And there were raids on people. Some were called too old, some were too young. People were arrested, taken away every day, and we didn't know where they were going. I remember that one day, my mom told me to hide with my grandparents because they wouldn't get a permit anymore. And since we lived in this huge house with a huge backyard, there was a courtyard-like, and there was so much, a big hill, a dirty hill with all kinds of leaves and dirt. And we made like a tunnel, and we crawled into it, my grandparents and I. My mother covered us, and she had to go to work. Why I didn't go to work, I don't know, I don't remember. And I remember laying on our stomach, and I remember the ground was shaking like it was an earthquake, because the soldiers came in the huge trucks, and they were so heavily armed, and they were running through the sidewalk, and it felt like the whole ground was shaking. And they ran through the courtyard, and they were looking for people in hiding, and they could find, obviously, people, because I could hear shots. They were breaking windows, throwing dishes and furniture outside. It was terrifying. And then they started to leave. And I was so lucky they didn't have dogs with them, because otherwise they would have found us. And they left. And after a while, my mom came in and helped us to crawl out from under all that dirt. And we're standing there trying to, clean up. We were so dirty. I remember taking leaves out of my hair. And all of a sudden, we came face to face with the last patrol of the day. And they were young boys, maybe 18, 20. They didn't ask any questions because they knew that my grandparents didn't have a permit. So it was a miracle that they didn't shoot me and my mom. Obviously, we were part of it. And I remember my grandparents walking away, and my grandmother turned back and she whispered, "Don't worry, we'll be okay." Of course, we never knew because we couldn't expect, because we couldn't think, we couldn't imagine where all those people were going. We knew didn't never heard from anybody who was taken away, but then we felt, well, during the war, how do you expect mail? Because it was unthinkable that in 20 centuries, there are people whose main goal is murder, that their hate is so huge, and that a man that looked like and was Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler wanted to have an Aryan race, everybody blonde and blue-eyed, young and strong. You've all seen pictures of Adolf Hitler. Black hair, black mustache. When he talked, he looked comical. I mean, to me, when I look at him, some pictures now, I say, how could people believe him? Well, he looks more Jewish than any Jew I know. How could people who are well educated, how could the church not say a word, just accept it, just don't care, just believe the propaganda that the Jews were inhuman, they were worse than the cockroaches and the rats? How could millions of people believe that 1% of the Jewish people living in Germany could be responsible for everything? For the fact that Germany lost the war, for the fact that there was maybe some unemployment, for the fact that some people couldn't get a job, for a marriage that was bad. All this was the fault of the Jews. And of course, the tragic thing is that it seems like the hate is coming back. You know, there is nothing in this world worse than hate. Hate makes people blind and deaf. They don't hear, they don't see. And I try very hard to teach my students that it is so much easier to be kind than to hate. I remember that the day came at midnight. There was a knock at our door in midnight in the ghetto, and my father was arrested. My father was, somebody was told that my father was a member of the resistance, which was not true. And when they took my father away, I could not imagine how we could survive. My father took care of us. Who would take care of us? And then, just the way you saw in the movie, Amon Get came into the Krakow ghetto to liquidate the ghetto and to build a concentration camp about 7 kilometers outside of the ghetto in a place called Plaszów, a small village. And everybody said he was from Vienna. And we said, well, if he is from Vienna, then he certainly is going to be good for us, because after all, only in Vienna people are kind of good and smart, so he's going to be different. Well, Amon Get was one of the most sadistic, inhuman beings I ever heard of. I ever hope not to ever hear again. Do you know that all those years that I stood in front of him, because when we went to Plaszów, we had to stand every morning and every night to be counted. I never looked at him. He was a big, tall man, and he always wore a white scarf. And I always felt that if I don't look at him, I don't make eye contact, then he won't see me. And I was shown a picture of him after the war, just before he was hung in Krakow. I asked, who is it? Because he was so tall and so heavy when he was during the war, that when he stood with a group of 50 other soldiers, I could tell it was him. I just never looked at his face. The camp was built in a little village that had 2 Jewish cemeteries. The cemetery had to be leveled, and you can't imagine what it looked like. And they took all the men, all the Jewish men, to build the barracks, and all the women to try and build a road from broken tombstone. When the time came that the camp was ready, we had to be evacuated from the ghetto. My mom and I were taking care of my little cousin, Jenny. She was 5 years old. Her mother was my mother's sister. And by some miracle, when they were taken away, when my father was still with us, somehow he was able to save her, and she lived with us. When we went to work, my mom and I, the children in the ghetto were hidden. They had to be either behind a false wall or under the bed. And they were so smart, they were quiet. They knew they couldn't make any noise. You know, Hitler, of course, wanted everybody blonde and blue-eyed. And our children, like children everywhere, they came in all colors. Some were blonde. I had some cousins that were blonde and blue-eyed. So was my aunt. Some had dark hair, brown eyes, green eyes. They were beautiful. Children are always beautiful, not in the eyes of the Germans. For them, Jewish children were not allowed to live. I tried to take my little cousin Jenny and take her to Plaszow with me. And in a way, I was glad when I was stopped by a Jewish policeman and said to me, "You can't take her with you. You leave her in the orphans' home, she will be better off." And I agreed with him because I knew where we were going. It would be horrible in the barracks. And this was a house where they had children from all over surrounding Krakow, whose parents were already killed. And there were some older people there who didn't want to leave the children and stayed with them. And I thought she would be better off. And I left her with people that I knew who stayed with their little children. Because how could anybody imagine that you leave little beautiful children and that when you're going to leave, they're going to be murdered? It was unthinkable. It is still unthinkable to this day that people, supposedly humans, could commit such horrible, horrible crimes. There was a letter, a speech that Himmler told his officers in Poznan in 1943 after they killed over 10,000 people. And Himmler made a speech saying to his officers that you have committed a great job and you stayed strong mostly through it, with some few exceptions. You are heroes because you did what you had to do. But it was the speech that will never be written and you cannot never tell. But I am very proud of you. You are all very honorable people. Is that what you call murderers? You know, when we left ghetto, I remember hearing shooting, but I still didn't remember. You know, I still couldn't imagine that little children were killed and the rest was sent to Auschwitz. The concentration camp in Plaszow was terrible. I mean, the huge barracks, the narrow spaces, you know, we didn't have bunk beds, we had like shelves, 3 floors of 3-story heights, not enough food, and of course the conditions were horrible. We were exposed every morning and every night to public hanging, public shooting, or whatever Amon Get felt like doing. One of his first victims, 3 days after we were in camp, Amon Get walked into one of the barracks where my grandfather and one of his sons, one of my uncles, were in painting and with other people. He took his revolver, he shot my uncle, who was standing there painting. You just never knew which corner is going to bring death. My mom and I were very lucky because we heard about Oskar Schindler for a long time. We heard from people who worked for him. As you all know, Oskar Schindler was born in Czechoslovakia. He was a German. He was one of the first to join the Nazi Party. Oskar Schindler was a very ambitious young man. He wanted very much to become rich. Before the war, he used to sell farm equipment. And he traveled to Krakow a lot, and he loved Krakow. And so when Germany invaded Krakow, he followed them after a few months. He was very smart and very ambitious. He made great so-called friends with the generals, high-ranking generals, and also with the politicians. This way, when he took over a factory that was making pots and pans before the war, he converted part of the factory for making ammunition and the other part for making pots and pans and other things needed. So they were doubly needed by the War Department and by his homeland. And because he had such an outgoing personality, and because he needed those people, he made the generals and the politicians his best friend. He bribed them all the time. They had unlimited amount of drinks, and he bought them gifts on the black market. And they all liked him because he drank with them, but he never got drunk. He gambled with them, and he always lost. And he was a lot of fun. And so because he needed Amon Ged, he became a very good friend of Amon Ged. He needed Amon Ged because his workers were walking between Plaszow and 7 kilometers back to the factory outside of the ghetto. And so Oskar Schindler, his fame started very slowly by whispering, because people were afraid that by whispering the Germans may find out that Oskar Schindler liked his workers, that he was kind to the people who work for him, that many times he would keep people overnight, not letting them to return to the ghetto and then to the camp when he knew that Amon Ged was going to kill people. That had to be a secret, because with the Germans for a moment suspected that Oskar Schindler was good to his workers, they would kill him. Well, Oskar Schindler asked Amon Ged for permission to build a small camp next to the factory so he could get more out of his workers, so they wouldn't waste all this time instead of walking back and forth between the camp and the factory. And I remember my mother sent me to the man in charge of the list. His name was Marcel Goldberg, and he and his wife and sister shared our room in the ghetto. So my mom and I were lucky enough to go and work for Oskar Schindler. Leaving Plaszow and leaving Amon Ged behind was like going to heaven. I mean, when I first stood in front of Oskar Schindler, I said, surely God had sent us an angel, or it was my father coming back reincarnated, because he was kind, and he smiled, and he cared about his people. This one thing that stands out the most about Oskar Schindler, that he did not say, there is nothing I can do. Oskar Schindler looked at his people and knew what was happening, and he knew the plans the Germans had for us. And he said, I can't stand by and do nothing. Oskar Schindler has changed the way people think. The people who said, there's nothing I can do. There is always something you can do. And Oskar Schindler did it. He risked his life, but he helped. Not only did we have a better, smaller barracks, but our working conditions were so much better. I was one of the younger people working on small machines, lathes, where we were making shells for ammunition. And I was very good at it. We all were, but I remember I was very fast. It was piecework you had to do. And I remember that one day, one of the foremen, who was German, one of the foremen said to me, come, I want you to work on another machine. And it was a big press, the one that's in a movie. And I worked on it for maybe 3 hours. the machine broke down. It was always breaking down. Well, the foreman started to scream at me that I committed a sabotage and he's going to call a guard and they will kill me. And I remember crying. I remember I was petrified. And I was, the factory was like two buildings. The part where I was making ammunition and another part that was making the pots and pans. And joining it was like a bridge, glass bridge. And you could see Oskar Schindler walking through the bridge. And he came down and he looked at me and he looked at the machine. He asked the foreman what happened. And the foreman, of course, is yelling, she committed a sabotage. And then Oskar Schindler started yelling at the foreman. He said, how can a little girl like that break a huge machine like this? And he gave orders that only a man would be allowed to work on that big machine. And he said, I can go back. Where do you want to go? I said, I want to go back to my machine. And he said that from now on, that's where she should be. And after that, every morning, because every morning he used to come into the factory. And he would always pat me on my head, and he would say, Wie geht's es, Kleine? I mean, I could be standing here for 3 hours to tell you all the good, amazing things that Oskar Schindler did to help his people. The fact to make them human, to feel as human. The way he came into a factory with a cigarette and would leave it at every man's, he would light a cigarette, leave it to a machine that was operated by men because women in those days didn't smoke. Or when he would come in and smile at you, or when somebody got sick, you knew you could go to the doctor in the camp because they would save you, they would help you, they wouldn't kill you. If somebody needs special, I had a friend who was diabetic. And actually, Oskar Schindler was getting help. I mean, he had a reputation for being a playboy. He most certainly was not a good husband. His wife actually didn't live with him when he was in Krakow. He had many mistresses. And he was fun to be with. That's why everybody, all the soldiers, all the generals and so on, liked him. But the people that worked for him worshipped him, because we believed in him. So when the orders came that the factory is going to be closed because the Germans were losing the war against the Allies, but they were determined to win the war against the Jews. So they were, they're closing up, liquidating all the camps and sending the prisoners in other camps. And that's when Oskar Schindler made the famous deal with Amon Get. He gave him a fortune of diamonds. He brought him God knows what else. And he agreed that Oskar Schindler could move his factory to Brnic, Czechoslovakia, which was near where he was born, where he lived. And all his workers will go with him. So the women were the first to be taken out of the camp. We were tattooed by the Jewish doctor with a KL, which stood for concentration lager, which means concentration camp. And it was done by the Jewish doctors that never did it before. So after a couple of years, our letters, that KL, disappeared. Unlike those of our brothers and sisters were tattooed in Auschwitz, and they go to the grave with the number on their arm. And I sure hope there's a special place for them. We were so lucky. I remember they sent us to Prashov, actually, for a couple of weeks before the factory in Czechoslovakia was ready. And I remember that my mom and I worked in a warehouse with another mom and dad girl. And there were tons of clothing, silver, paintings, everything that was taken from the Jewish people. And we packed it in boxes that were sent to Germany. And then it was time to leave. And I remember we were loaded onto the boxcar. There were 300 women, and we were put into 2 boxcars. We were so tightly packed that nobody could move. They locked the door. There was no air. There was no food. There was no water. There were no bathroom facilities. And the train stood on the station for many, many hours. When the train finally started to move, somehow We tried to look through the little holes in the wood. It didn't look familiar. We didn't know where we were going. And after what it seemed like an eternity, when the train finally stopped and the door opened, it was late at night, it was midnight, and the spotlight shone on the train. And I remember we looked up and we saw like miles and miles of barbed wires. We saw what it seems like hundreds and hundreds of soldiers, of course heavily armed with the dogs, and there was the sign Auschwitz-Birkenau. And then we realized that the rumors we heard were true. We heard rumors. People were talking. But who could believe it? In the 20th century, could you believe that people would actually build a place to murder the fastest they could? It was unthinkable. It is unthinkable then, it's unthinkable now, it will be unthinkable forever. I remember when we were told to jump down, there were prisoners helping us, and there was a terrible stench in Auschwitz. And it was early November, and it was cold, and we thought it was snowing, and we were so thirsty, so we tried to catch the snowflakes, but there were no snowflakes, those were ashes. You know, the visitors from Berlin, when they came in to visit the families of the guards who lived nearby, they were always told that the guards couldn't let the children play outside, and they couldn't let their dogs outside because of the ashes. We were so close to the city of Auschwitz that there is no way somebody say, I didn't know. We were right there. I remember they told us to run. And I could see ahead of me chimneys. It was late at night, and yet the smoke coming out, fire coming out, was clearly visible. I remember we finally stopped running, with the soldiers shouting at the dogs, barking at us, and we stopped in front of a huge barrack, and there was a group of very well-dressed and well-fed SS officers. And I remember one of them especially, he had a whip, they all had whips in their hands, and they were sending some women to the right and some to the left, and we realized those going to the left could barely walk. So we started, to pinch our cheeks to look healthy, straighten out. We were sent to the right. It was a big hall, as big as this, empty. At one end, you saw people doing something, we didn't realize what. And there was a bench all around the walls. And we were told to strip from top to bottom. And we stood in line, it was cold. And then we realized what they were doing. First of all, they were searching in everybody's mouth. If you had a gold tooth, they would pull it. And they were shaving our hair from top to bottom. And I remember they were pulling our hair, and we were crying because it was, they didn't have good scissors. Electric shaver didn't exist yet. And it was hurting. We were bleeding. And they said, well, don't cry, you're going to the showers. And they pushed us into the dark room, just you see it in a movie. It was dark, we couldn't see anything. All of a sudden, the light came on and the water came down. And I look at my mother, and I look at all the women that I was with for so many years. I didn't recognize them. Because when they shaved my hair and everybody else's hair, I think we felt so totally dehumanized. And it just, I couldn't explain. I felt like I lost me. There was no me anymore. Because when I was little, I had braids. When we went to the ghetto, my mother took me to the hairdresser to cut my braids. And my dad cried, why did you cut her braid? And my mom said, because it's easier to keep clean. And then all the way in the camp, we always kept our hair short because it's easier to take care. We didn't have a shampoo, we didn't have towel. But what do the girls do when they get out in the morning? The first thing you do, you comb your hair, right? You wash your hair, you try to curl it up with your fingers. You're still human. You still feel like you. I look at my mom and I said to her, I'm glad it's over. Now we are dead. So it wasn't that painful. And my mother said, we are not dead, we are alive. And I said, no, we can't be alive. And she said, touch me. And the shower stopped. And they pushed us to the other side of the room. And they were as women. And they were more sadistic, more horrible than the men. We were wet. We were shaking. There was a pile of wooden shoes. And you were told to put your shoes on. And you couldn't, choose the sizes or anything. You just stuck your foot in. And of course, you got blisters right away. You put a wet foot into a wooden shoe, you got blistered. And then there was a bunch of clothing on the floor. I think they didn't have enough uniforms anymore. So we did not get any uniforms. We were just pulling clothes they took away from other people before they were sent to the gas chambers. And I remember there was a dress. I could see it was yellow and red. But just before the war started, I was going into the 5th grade. And for the first time ever, my mom allowed me to choose my own fabric and took me to the dressmaker to make the dress that I like. And the dressmaker was one of my cousins who was very gifted. And even though we wore uniforms in school in those days, still it was a dress that I had chosen. And of course, I look at it and I thought, maybe it's mine. They took everything I owned anyway, it could be mine. So I started pulling on that dress. And it was a yellow dress with some red flowers, but it was chiffon. And it was huge. I mean, it was really made for a big fat lady. And I was a little skinny thing. So I remember that I tied it around me. I was wet, I didn't have any towel. I remember tying it around me like 10 times so I wouldn't fall. And they pushed us out to the other side of Auschwitz. And I remember looking. And all I can say, what Elie Wiesel always says, if you were not there, you can't imagine it, because there are no words that can describe what Auschwitz was like. Auschwitz was a huge place. Auschwitz I was actually a place where the Polish army had its headquarters before the war. But Auschwitz-Birkenau was what the Germans built for the sole purpose of killing and burning the Jews. And I remember when we walked through the mud. All I remember from Auschwitz, it was November, it was freezing, probably it was snowing. I don't remember the snow. I remember the mud. Everywhere you look, there was mud. The barracks were cold. The women in charge of the Hungarian, they didn't speak Polish or German, and we didn't speak Hungarian. Whatever they wanted us to do, they were screaming, we didn't know what to do. Every morning, every night, we had to stand in for roll call. And you never knew if somebody would be taken away and not being brought back. One day, 2 soldiers came and took me and a young friend, and we were, of course, crying, but they said, oh, they will be back. They took me and my friend, 2 Jewish girls who were designed to be murdered. They took us to a little clinic. In that clinic, there was a nurse. The nurses in those days, they had uniforms. And she, in her white outfit and with her white cap that she wore, she was very nice to us. What did they want from us? I want you to think about it. They brought us there to take blood from us, from 2 Jewish girls who were destined to be killed because we were not human. And they were it was an experiment to see if they can make plasma and send it to the Russian front to help to save the life of a German soldiers. That's what you want, that's an experiment. What they did, thinking, how come we were not good enough to live, but they were good enough to take blood from? But the good thing was that she was very nice to us, the nurse. And the soldier came back for us and brought us back from to the barrack where my mother thought she would never see me again. And it was then that Oskar Schindler made another deal with the people in charge. He bribed the commander of Auschwitz, Rudolf Haas, with a fortune of diamonds to get his workers back. He was told we were in Auschwitz 3.5 weeks. That we're not good anymore. We were ready to be sent to the fires, to the gas chambers. But he insisted. He says, no, those are trained workers. I want them back. So the 300 women on Schindler's List were sent back, went through the disinfection again, were put on trains, and we were sent out of Auschwitz, the only transport ever sent out of Auschwitz to live, not to be killed. I remember that we were seated this time. I remember my girlfriend was laying on my lap, and she was very sick. She had such a high fever. About an hour after we left Auschwitz-Birkenau, she broke up in scarlet fever. I remember sticking my skinny fingers through a little hole trying to get some snowflakes or icicles to put on her lips. If we stayed in Auschwitz, we would have been sent to the gas chambers immediately. Scarlet fever is infectious disease, another miracle that happened because of Oskar Schindler. And when the train finally stopped, there on the station was Oskar Schindler, waiting for us in his green Tyrolean hat with the feather in his head and with the cigarette in his hand always, a green long Tyrolean coat. And he says, well, you're finally here. I have hot soup waiting for you, and the men are waiting for you. The men went to Gross-Rosen and then sent to Brennitz after a few days. Mrs. Schindler came to Brennitz. She and Oskar had a little apartment on the factory floor, and they slept in that apartment every night. They had a beautiful villa not too far away, but they were afraid to let us alone under the guide of the guards, who were actually told to kill us as the war gets worse. And Oskar was always very good at bribing the soldiers. And the last 7 months of the war were hundreds and thousands of Jewish people, men and women, my brothers and sisters. They were all sent on the death marches where people dropped dead from the freezing cold, some without shoes, in the worst winter of the 20th century. Those thousands of us, 700 men, 300 women on Schindler's List. Oskar and Emily Schindler were begging for food from the friends on their farms. It was very hard to buy food. I remember my mother got very sick. She had an infection of gums. I went to Mrs. Schindler, and she gave me an onion for my mother. Mrs. Schindler had a little hospital in the basement of the factory. On Oskar Schindler's List, there were 2 people who died, normal deaths. An older lady from a heart attack and a young girl who had cancer. They were both buried in a casket in a place where the family after the war could bring them back to Jewish cemeteries. I don't know of any Jewish people murdered during the war that were buried in a casket. Mostly we know they were buried in a huge, huge graves where we don't know. So there is no way I would have survived if it wasn't for Oskar Schindler. And everything in the movie that you saw was true, actually did happen. Oskar Schindler, as the war was nearing to the end, he and one of the fellows on the list, Moshe Beisky, who became the Supreme Judge in Israel, they produced an order from Hitler for the Obersturmführer Leopold, who was in charge of the Jews in camp, to come to Berlin at once for an audience with Hitler. Naturally, he left. And of course, when he got to Berlin, where he wasn't invited, they didn't let him come back. They sent him to the Russian front. And the guards that remained in Brennitz, most of them have been changed already because of the younger one who was sent to the front. They were all now under Oskar Schindler. And Oskar Schindler made sure they had enough vodka so they wouldn't even think about digging graves to kill us. Oskar Schindler is one shining star, one person. Of course, we now know of more. But at that time, in spite of everything, he managed by a miracle, by his willpower, by his goodness, by the way he looked at human beings, to save 1,000 of people. And I think he's an example, and he will be an example for the rest of all our lives. Because he did not say, I can't do anything. He stood up and said, there's always something I have to do. I cannot let those people die. And this is the message that I would like. I would like to pass the torch of memory to the younger generation, to tell them that they are strong. They have the power of making a difference and change the world. It's really up to them. I know it's not going to happen in my lifetime anymore, but young people are being taught that there is always something they can do. They are strong and they are smart and they know what's right and what's wrong. I tell some of my students are in high school, middle school, I tell them, when you see somebody being bullying, don't just do nothing. Don't say there is nothing I can do. You can always do something. You can get help. Go to your teacher. When you see a new kid coming into the classroom, why don't you go over and say hi? They will respect you, and you will be proud. You did something good. See, we have to, again and again, pass the torch of memory to the people, that the next generations, because we cannot forget. Forgetting is dangerous. By allowing bad, hateful things happening again and again, we do injustice, not just to ourselves, but to the future generation. When the war ended, Oskar Schindler had to flee, to give himself up to the Americans. The Russians would have killed him because he was a member of the Nazis. He was a manufacturer of weapons. He was owner of slaves, and he was a capitalist. And the reason that the slaves survived because of him, it wouldn't matter anything to the Russians. The people, he called his people that he saved, his children. In Germany, they consider him a traitor. When he went to Argentina with the help of Jewish organizations after the war, he was unhappy there because he had to work. They bought him a mink farm. Mrs. Schindler work. He came back to fight for his pension. The Nazis didn't have to fight for their pension. The Nazis got their pension. They got the help from the Vatican to escape. Oskar Schindler was once beaten up and then taken to jail. The judge said he was guilty. While the other people beat him up, he was guilty. When Oskar Schindler went to visit Israel, he went to visit so-called his children. There were 4,000 people waiting for him at the airport. The children of his children and grandchildren. And every country has given him a medal. Even the Vatican gave him a medal. I'm only sorry that Oskar Schindler didn't live long enough to see the movie. Thomas Keneally wrote the book, but it was not a bestseller. When Steven Spielberg made the movie, everybody wanted to see it. After all, it was Steven Spielberg. People didn't know what to expect. The movie, Steven Spielberg didn't expect the movie to be such a success. He was shocked. The movie is the best teaching tool that we have. Because when the movie first opened, everybody went to see it. And people have learned. And at the same time, the movie has broken through the wall of silence, where the survivors didn't talk because nobody really wanted to hear. And the liberators didn't talk because they couldn't. And then everybody realized we have to talk. We have to make people remember. And that's my hope for the future. Younger generation, the young people that are coming, the young people that are stronger and will be wiser and will change the world. As John F. Kennedy said, whether you are white or black or yellow or green, whoever you believe in, when you cut your finger, your blood is red. And people have to become blind to the color and deaf to the religion. Who cares? We are underneath our skin. We are all the same. And maybe, just maybe, that's going to happen someday in my grandchildren or great-grandchildren lifetime. Maybe there won't be wars anymore. I hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Rena. Thank you so, so much. We're going to take a few questions. After the war, what did you do?
Well, after the war, my mom and I went back to Krakow to find out that the Polish people still hated us, and they still didn't want the Jews. And most of all, we found that my mom lost everybody in her family, because my dad was killed, my mother's family, my father and his 6 brothers. And we couldn't live in Krakow. We felt that the ground was soaked in blood. So we went to Austria, where the Americans and Jewish organizations were creating displaced person camps. And we lived in displaced person camp from 1945 to 1948. A couple of my friends and I had a private professor that came to the house to teach us, because we only went to 4th grade. We never went to the 5th grade, and I certainly didn't want to go back to school, to the German school. So we had a private tutor, and we were learning how to learn. Some people went to become shoemakers, dressmakers. People learn how to sew. I took a course in a cosmetic field, thinking that I'm going to like it. I didn't realize I would come with a diploma from a very fancy Vienna academy and would have to go back to school to get a diploma. So that was the end of my career. But I got married. My husband was left totally alone. Everybody in his family was gone, and I felt I had to save him. So, and we wanted to be normal. We wanted to start a life where we could make a living, not depend on anyone, be able to make money, pay rent, buy food, and waited for an affidavit to come to the United States. It was very difficult to get a visa. The United States was not very kind to the survivors after the war. They did not want us to come. It was until Truman became the president that things got easier. And people had to go to Israel. They had to be very careful. They had to smuggle themselves. Many were caught and put back on a concentration camp in Sicily. No, not in Italy, in Cyprus, actually.
Have you gone to the Schindler Museum in Krakow?
Did you?
Yeah.
Did you see my picture? My cousins went to, I have not been there, I was there before. My cousins went to, a lot of my younger cousins went to Krakow and the rest of the Poland, and they went to the museum, Schindler's Museum. When they walked in, they could hear my voice. Somebody was listening to my tape. All the Schindler's people have a tape over there with a picture in front, and somebody happened to listen to one of my tapes, and they started looking for me. They knew I wasn't there. They knew I was back home in Massachusetts. How did my cousins survive? By miracle. They survived by miracle because they were on the death march. There were 4 sisters. They were on a death march, and at one of the nights, they knew that they couldn't walk anymore, so they were able to hide in a barn. And when the group moved out, they were not found. And then they stayed in that barn for a couple of days. It was so close to the end of the war that when they started walking back, they came across the Americans. Till the very end, Hitler already committed suicide. And the soldiers still were killing the Jewish people. I don't think so. I'm sorry. There were so many heroes that you found after the war that, and there is, of course, a section in Washington and the Holocaust Memorial Museum of those people who risked their life that were not Jewish, risked their own lives, the lives of the families, and knew they would be caught, that they are hiding a Jewish person or Jewish family, and they still went on. Tragically, many of them did not tell the truth because they were afraid. Even after the war in Poland, some of the people who saved Jewish families were afraid to say so because their neighbor would kill them for saving a Jew. So I hope the world will be a better place.
Hi, I too thank you for coming. My parents were survivors from Germany and did not wish to talk about it at all. They felt that we were the sandwich generation, my brother and myself. At what age did you feel comfortable beginning to share your story, and how did you remain so psychologically strong about it all?
Well, you see, in the early 1970s, there was a professor in Sorbonne that published a paper that Holocaust didn't happen. We, the survivors of the Holocaust, are eyewitnesses. And we felt that we have a duty, responsibility to tell the story. We are the eyewitnesses. When we are no longer here, who is going to tell the story? Who is going to tell the truth? And that goes for the liberators also. So many of them walked into the camps they never expected to see. They were young boys. After the Battle of the Bulge, after all this fighting, they came, opened the gates to hell. And it is, I'm grateful to General Eisenhower, who knew that he wanted everybody to see and everybody know what the Germans did to human beings, because otherwise he was afraid people will not believe it, people will forget, and he was right. General Eisenhower made some of the senators, presidents of our countries, come to Bergen-Belsen and watch all the horrible things that were there, dead people everywhere. He made the citizen of Bergen-Belsen, who lived maybe a mile away, he made them come and bury the dead, because of course they lived a mile away and they didn't know, they never heard. And that is what gives us strength. You know, when I tell you what happened to me, I am there. When I saw the movie, it was like I left my seat and went into the movie. But how else can we make the people remember? Because again and again, Zahor, you cannot forget, because forgetting can be dangerous. Thank you.
Thank you, Rena, and thank you everyone for coming. We hope to see you again sometime soon. Early happy Passover.